Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to TEFAF Coffee Talks. My name is Linda Lees. I'm the director of the cultural program here, and we're delighted to have you on this sunshiny day after we've gone through so many days of rain and slightly gloomy. But it is fantastic today, which is, I think, completely appropriate to the topic. So we are going to have this wonderful conversation on the forces of nature. And I'm thrilled that we have this very prestigious panel, smaller than usual, but weighty in quality. So that's fantastic. A couple pieces of housekeeping. As usual, I have to ask you to turn off your phones. The best of us forget that minor detail, but it makes a difference, so please double check. Also, this is being live streamed on Facebook. It will then stay on Facebook for a couple of weeks, and when it's finally edited, it will go up on the website in perpetuity, as are all the talks that we've done since the fall of 2016. You can access all our panels there. I'm so happy because Kari Barrett is a friend and an excellent moderator, so it's always wonderful to have her here, and has done an outstanding job of bringing to us a very important topic today. Her complete title here is President and CEO of the New York Botanical Garden. So I hand it over to Kari.
Thank you. I hope that they've said the other talks don't have trouble without a mic, even though, Linda, you were on a mic. We're going to do our best. You can all hear me? Okay. So I'm Kari Barrett. I'd admit, as a friend, I know Linda because we once upon a time both taught at the Sotheby's Institute of Arts together in different programs, but sort of bonded over cultural life in New York City and the ways that many of us could help with this. In introducing myself, I would say that I had a long and wonderful and very rewarding career at the Metropolitan Museum of Art until last year, a year more than that, when a search firm called and said, "We know you're not moving, we know you're not going anywhere, but we just want you to come on one interview for this job." He said, "What's the job?" I said, would be president of the New York Botanical Garden. I said, "I have a PhD in art history. My field is early American painting. Why would you want to interview me?" And they said, "Kari, it's a museum of plants." So I went for one interview just to see what it was like, and 4 months later got the job. And since then have been absolutely transfixed by not only my museum of plants, but I was just telling a colleague in the audience, I think it's like when you drive a Volkswagen and all you see are Volkswagens. I remember when I've got 2 daughters, and when I was pregnant, all you see are other pregnant women. So right now, all I can see are plants. I have this whole new appreciation for plants, and I'm also deeply, deeply, as an art historian now running a garden, deeply vested in art in nature, to make it simple. Art made out of natural materials, art that takes its impetus or its expression from nature, but also the environment, climate change. I think we'll get into all of these things. So before I say, I want to introduce my fellow panelists here, David Collens, who's director at Storm King Art Center, a 40-year career focused on a vast landscape. Of those of you who've been to Storm King, I hope you all have. It's a magnificent place. David has just opened a new exhibition on Mark Dion, actually this weekend, which I think he'll tell us something about. And Michelle Okadonor, my new friend and the garden's artist in residence. Michelle is an artist and author who works in a variety of media, creating many, many, many public and private installations, the most famous of which is the Walk on the Beach. If any of you have traipsed through the Miami airport, you've seen the sort of quarter-mile long bronze and terrazzo concourse, which is really, really beautiful. I'm glad to be working with Michelle at the garden and people are saying, so what is she making? Before long we'll know what, but what I was really interested in, it was hard for even my colleagues there to say, it's not a commission, it's a residency, it's a way to help me talk about the landscape in a different way. I have horticulturalists, scientists, educators, retailers, all of the various people trustees, donors, people who all see the garden in different ways. And what I felt we were lacking was an artist who would come in and just talk about this. and ask me questions like, are there fireflies here? And know that that's not only part of the biodiversity of the garden itself, but actually is part of Mother Nature's canvas. In setting up this panel, when Linda, I've done one at, I think, every TEFAF, and I would say a little self-serving, partly not just because I'm friends with Linda, but because we were come up with a topic that was sort of a burning issue. And again, in the, I drive a Volkswagen, and now I don't really, but I only see Volkswagens because I have been conscious of art and the environment. The kinds of articles and news stories that now jump out at me are in the museum section on March 14th, Alina Tuged's article on Can Art Help Save the Planet? Wrote a great article that was talking about all the current exhibitions of historic and contemporary art happening all over the country that take nature or the environment as their focus. The Cooper Hewitt Design Triennial opens in just a few days, May 10th, and it's called Nature. It includes 62 projects focused on how designers and artists are collaborating with scientists, engineers, and environmentalists to find solutions to help our planet. And the current Milan Triennial, curated by the magnificent Paola Antonelli, is called Broken Nature, Design Takes on Human Survival, addressing humanity's troubled relationship with nature. She invited artists and architects and designers representing 40 different countries and tried to accessibly present complex data and grapple with aspects of life in the Anthropocene, which I'm going to leave for maybe Michelle to talk about. So that's my preamble. It's why we're here. That's a lot. The last thing I'll say is that I think from that early question of, oh, I'm an art historian, why would you want me to lead a botanical garden? Oh, it's a museum of plants. What I also became focused on is that almost all of our great museums, I can't think of one that isn't. The great museums, the founding museums in this country, and the ones that came after it over, the Met is about to turn 150. My botanical garden is 128 years old. Every one of these museums is in a park. St. Louis, Denver, Chicago, Boston, with the fens. You think about it as the landscape that surrounds it, but the great city planners, the great cultural leaders of our country that developed museums from the 1870s onward, put them in landscapes. And in large measure, those have been preserved, and those that aren't are being, rejuvenated. What has just happened at Indianapolis, where what was called Old Fields and was a museum in a park is now called New Fields, one aggregated institution, this is sort of, a very simplistic way of putting it, but where Charles Venable, the director, realized that while going to an art museum might be a cultural activity that was a little intimidating, walking through a rose garden was completely accessible to anyone. And if the entree was through a landscape, chances are someone would look to their partner and say, honey, there's an art museum. Maybe we should go. Because the flowers and the trees and the grass and the fireflies had already warmed them up for whatever was going to be inside would be beautiful and not intimidating, or I don't know anything about the Italian Renaissance or the ancient Egyptians, but even they lived at the same place. So I'm going to cut myself off and maybe ask David to talk a little, your thoughts. Would love to hear about Mark Dion and whatever you want to say about Storm King and its place in this terrific dialogue.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you for being here.
I'll start with Storm King and lead into Mark Dion. Storm King started in 1960, and we have been moving on landscape for 45 years with Bill Rutherford and our founder, Ted Ogden. The New York Thruway went in the early 1950s and left Storm King with, as an environmental disaster, as what the word Bill Rutherford used to describe Storm King Art Center when he first saw it, because the gravel came from what is now our property and was moved to the Thruway, and we have pools of water and very poor drainage in other areas off the hills. So we spent 45 years moving 1 million yards of gravel to different sites, creating hillsides for sculpture, walking paths through the fields in other areas, and really restoring the landscape. It's a process that never is finished, but it's terrific. Artists love it. We've commissioned sculptures for different landscapes at Storm King, like Richard Serra's an outstanding example in our farm field, and Mark DeSuvro sits in a field that was reclaimed so you wouldn't get wet feet walking through the farm fields and have problems with machinery being pulled out because it was muddy and wet. And more recently, we've moved into different exhibitions where we have asked a number of younger artists with our Outlooks program that our senior curator, Nora Lawrence, has led for the last 7 years. And each artist is asked to react to Storm King and different landscapes, and we've really come out with outstanding exhibits of their work. They do one sculpture that lasts for a season, and this year it's Jean Shin. She's the 7th artist in the series. And we have Mark Dion as the exhibition of Follies, which is the first exhibition of his Follies to take place. It's 25 years that he's been working on Follies, and they are in different locations on our 500 acres, as well as 2 floors in the museum building and our gallery space. And it's really outstanding what both artists have done in different ways at the Art Center.
That's fantastic. You had talked about, I love when you said it was a disaster. I think when we talked earlier, you said you didn't want it to become a golf course. I'm also interested in how meadows are created and how I'm conscious of turf. How much of it, how much, when does a landscape need to be curated? Not just the artworks that you're putting on it, but your care of your galleries, as it were.
Oh, that's a very good point. And for Storm King, it really started as farm fields, and the fields were farmed with corn and grain sorghum and other crops until the 1970s. The farm went out of business. So we decided to just mow the fields for a while, and then people started commenting about 25 years ago that it looked like a golf course, and that didn't appeal to us because we were mowing everything in sight, and maybe our groundspeople really enjoyed doing that, being on large machines, going back and forth mowing. So Bill Rutherford was a terrific landscape architect working for the 45 years at Storm King and creating the landscape that I described, but you must come out and see it. There's no substitute, whether it's weather like yesterday or weather like today. It's wonderful in all weather conditions. But we decided we didn't want to be known as a golf course, and anyway, we hired Daryl Morrison, who's an expert on tall grasses, to come to Storm King, and Daryl, for the last 22 years, has been working on the native grasses, which also have wildflowers, and they're these large free-form areas of at least half an acre that we've set up throughout the property, and we grow the native grasses, and it's a very hard job, and they take a lot of maintenance. It looks very easy, and they're very beautiful after all these years. They're about 4 feet high and blow around in the wind, and then the early spring we try to burn the grasses when we have good weather. We get permits in early March without too much wet ground conditions or snow on the ground, hopefully, and we go through and burn, and it's nutritious for the earth and excellent to keep invasive plant material out, and adds a totally different dimension to Storm King, and it's very much a part of our landscape at this point.
That's amazing. We could do like a Burning Man at Storm King.
We could. Everyone always asks about that, and we cancel at the last minute because of wind direction and so forth.
Yeah, it would be dangerous, but it's fascinating. As I say, I'm seeing things in a whole new way, and those grasses that you're not cutting are beautiful in winter because they're covered. They're like sculptural in winter. So that interest that you think, oh, meadow sounds like spring, but meadow is also spectacular in the winter.
And it's excellent for birds and bees, and we want to attract more wildlife and insects to Storm King. And we have winter walks, so that is wonderful for our membership program and the general public in January, February, and March.
Marvelous. Oh. Michelle, over to you. I had kind of tossed out the Anthropocene, but maybe tell us a little bit about your work. And I know there's so many things that you and I have been talking about that's pertinent to this topic.
Well, the garden is really, even though I haven't spent that much time there, it's, I'd say, on all levels, a second home. Being born and raised in Miami Beach, I'll say before television even.
Hard to believe, right?
Isn't it amazing? And it was right after the war and not very developed. So there were empty lots. And when television came, it enlightened us because it had Tarzan. And we saw all the vines all of a sudden as opportunity. And we had such a great time. And recently I spoke at the Kampong, which is David Fairchild's personal home. And he had brought the seeds with him for the trees that grew around me. So I grew up with these best friends of trees, even the bad ones, the Australian pine, which are invaders. They had such fabulous sound in the evening when the wind came through, and started on Pine Tree Drive and went down where the golf course was, where I lived, and it sounded like the whole island was a harp. So, of course, I was seduced. And then the little pine needles, everything. And it's still there. In fact, someone who introduced all of us, really, Leonard Abbas, said, yes, they've got to get rid of those trees. They're uprooting the street. And I actually said, too bad. You know, it's poetic justice. So I'd say my work started in that way, in that place. It's about falling in love. What I also learned from many hours of observation as a child outdoors was process, watching things. I can't say I ever saw the bud break into the flower, even though I thought if I sat long enough, it might. But I did go to bed wondering what certain things were, and the next day when I went out, they were revealed. So these are very early and primal memories. So imagine my immense dissatisfaction at picking up the New York Times, and realizing that Miami Beach was going to go underwater. It was like, what? You know, what about my trees and what about what's there? So it was a real wake-up call. But when I was looking for some material over the weekend, because I have worked with nature and replicating the process one other time, mineral accretion technology, I saw that it was dated 1991 and that I had mentioned the process as an aid to global warming. So when I realized how long the notion has been embedded, but it's only visible now that the Royal Society has determined, not 100% signed, that, is it pronounced the Anthropocene or the, I always wonder, that's how I say it, because anthro means,
Anthropocene.
yes, that we are in a new epoch.
Yeah.
Well, how exciting, you know. When I started out in college, we were looking at the New York School and abstract expressionists, and Brancusi was considered art and nature. So I'm so delighted to be at the beginning of a whole new epoch. Whoever would have thought? And at the garden, which is at the same moment. So Kari, because my good friend Judith Thurman had interviewed Michael Ballack, who works as your ethnobotanist, about 2 years ago for an article on language. And she kept saying, Michelle, you've got to meet this guy. You've just got to meet this guy. So the first thing I said to Kari is, oh, I'd love to be. Thank you very much. Can I meet Michael Ballack? So, oh, all right. So she brought him to the loft. So I thought he'd be like me. If I saw what I saw, I'd get all excited. But he's very calm, and he looked around for about a half an hour, and finally we sat down, and I said, so Michael, what would you think an artist could bring to the New York Botanical Garden that would add to the conversation, add to all the work that's been done, add to the vocabulary? So the first thing he said, I love this, he said, a stand of birch. I've always wanted a stand of white birch. So I turned to Kari and I said, Kari, can't you just give it to him? And then he thought for a minute, as Kari was so correct, she didn't offer, I thought on the spot, she'd say, oh, Michael, of course, where would you like it? But then I realized she's the director of an institution that has process, So he said, solar, we need solar, make a sculpture out of solar panels, which turns out to be a brilliant idea. So that got me going, and that has been a very exciting notion of what to bring and how to bring it, and have it be a source of power. Ask Kari to look and see which site, which building we could empower. And of course, the next morning I woke up and I said, oh, it's the sorceress. She's the source of power. And she's going to have a great golden sieve, which is where planting began 10,000 years ago, in the Neolithic period, the agrarian beginning. The sieve was the symbol of the collecting of all the grains and the rices and everything. And in there, we'll have the 7 biblical species. So we're going back 3,000 years to 10,000 years to the Anthropocene. It's going to be that kind of range, I think.
I love it. You're laughing. So the Anthropocene is so interesting because depending on which crowd you're in, it's either, I love Michelle, she's so positive. We're in a new era. This is great. But if you're walking down a street where there are no plants and people aren't looking and they're just on their phones and that's what we're actually talking about is the way that humans are not paying attention to the environment, not paying attention to plants. And so I always stop myself because I'm not a climatologist. I'm an art historian who runs a garden, and the best thing that I think any of us can do is to attract people into nature. There is something that I've been studying with mainly my educators is a concept called plant blindness, where it isn't knowing the difference between an oak and a maple, or being able to recognize, a hydrangea or an azalea. Most of us know what those things are, but it's being absolutely oblivious to it. But then knowing in some way that if you take a walk in nature, even a run in Central Park, or I hear people say all the time, I come to your garden and I just feel better. I just feel better. And so we're working on a concept at the garden. It's a marketing campaign, but it's basically, the cure for plant blindness is first to see plants, to actually stop, it's literally stop and smell the roses. You see them. And then if you see them, you might want to get to know them. What is that? That's so beautiful. So the stopping is, I wonder what that is. And when you know them, you start to love them. So see, know, love, and then the last one. And when you love them, you'll want to save them. This is a concept of just getting people, because the things that you love, you want to save, whether it's people or plants. So I think what we're doing, to get it back to what we're doing in all of these institutions is also trying to attract people to places that can heal. And I'm a firm believer now that nature is at the basis of many, 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 many other cures, maybe, to what we're going through. But that see, know, love, save, along the way, it's about people and plants. So the person feels better, and that plants have a better chance of survival, right? You're nodding, yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely so. I fully agree.
It's what you're doing, at Storm King, I think. If it takes a Marc de Souvero or a Marc Dion to draw people into nature, they are also spending a day outdoors, which is a choice, right?
Definitely, because people come to Storm King not just for the sculptures, but the 500-acre landscape and the programs we're doing, and the artists are doing programs that, working with our educator and curatorial department, that they want to do, and we want to really hear what their vision is and
That's great.
get it out to the public.
That's fantastic.
You left out eat plants. Without plants, we can't live.
Oh, well, that's my favorite subject now, as I learn. So I went to Washington a month or so ago for the Garden Club of America, which I promise you is not, blue-haired ladies in little hats with like with pruning shears in their pocket. It's a powerful, powerful group. And the reason they invited me was to help them get the botany bill through Congress. It actually got represented by a senator from Illinois the next day, but we're talking about these very, very serious, these are the people these are the followers of Rachel Carson, the great environmentalists of the early 20th century. But I asked to be seated at lunch next to, I don't think he's here, but to the head of the Audubon Society, who gave a compelling, compelling talk about the work that they're doing nationwide. But my favorite thing that I told him was, and there's more federal money now going to the protection of species like that are cute and fly or have a tail. And I'm in a position now to say that without plants, nothing would survive.
Nothing.
Your cute little birds, done for. The squirrels, anything. So part of what, we're off on a tangent here, but I think part of what our institutions can do, I'm saying through art and through plants, is actually planetary saving, right?
Absolutely. Well, I think since the beginning of agriculture, Cicero said in the 2nd century BC that we plant seeds, we plant trees, we sow seeds. It seems that man creates with his hand a second nature.
Wow.
So he knew we were altering it, and then in the Renaissance, Jacopo Bonafido came and said, well, if you're going to plant the tree, if you put one here and one here outside your hut, you've got third nature, the taking aesthetics to the planting. So it took it a third. We are on the fourth right now, which is the combination of technology with nature. So, and that is positive technology. The other technology, which maybe we could say is what farming, industrial farming has done, has not been the positive. But what we plan to do is replicate what the trees do themselves. They eat the sunshine, and they create for themselves foods, sugar and starch. If we can make sculpture, if artists can come in and create a situation where their sculpture is eating the sunshine and then feeding the building, we have done what I'll call an inversion of fourth nature.
Oh, that's so powerful. You've also, I love your term, ecstatic nutrition, which is not only about real feeding, but about the spirituality, the universality. I'll go out on a kind of a limb here. To be fed by nature, to really, really be in touch with nature is a beautiful, beautiful thing. There's a degree of wellness with it, how we're fed by it without even realizing.
We always had it. We've just been through a terrible divorce.
Right.
But we've always been in touch with nature. People always went outdoors and picked the herb for their tea or milked and touched their animals. It's just so recent. And it's since the Industrial Revolution, it's only 200 years. And that's the wonderful writings of D.H. Lawrence. If you think about Lady Chatterley's lover, he was an agrarian. He had dirt under his nails. He was the gardener. And so all of his writings, if you look at it through the lens of the separation of people from their land and into urban centers, it's so extraordinary. He knew, E.M. Forster knew, he wrote an extraordinary short story, The Machine, Is It Stops or Ends? It's a must read. It really predicts where we are now with our iPhones, you know. So it's new. 200 years is nothing. We can wipe that out with Storm King in the New York Botanical Garden.
Well, I'm so pleased to have David here because I think Storm King is on, I think, you know, without Storm King, there would be no Dia Beacon without, I mean, the great in our area, you know, place where there is this kind of outdoors. I'm interested just to shift a little bit in things that I had been reading even before I left the Met that come through studies of what we call visitor experience, you know, so here's my little spiel that I've learned from, this is data collecting. It's a nationwide study. So it's you or you're I don't know, there's no typical family of 4 anymore, but you're people on a weekend, you have time and a little disposable income, and you're looking for, you know, we could call it culture, I guess. The New York Botanical Garden is actually in the New York City cultural interest groups, which include zoos and botanical gardens and museums. Smart. Started in 1869, when the American Museum of Natural History was the first museum to be funded by the city, followed in close succession by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the New York Botanical Garden, the Brooklyn Museum, starting in 5. We were the first cultural interest group. So that interests me it's interesting to me that the garden was always thought of as part of culture. But the answer to so a little bit of money and a little bit of time on a weekend or whatever, what do you choose to do? And it isn't aware, and the 95% of people said what they're looking for with that time and that income is something that brings them joy. And the second one was well-being. So they kind of mean the same thing. Maybe not, you know, we could talk about that, but these are just words that people said. What that means then is you say, what brings you joy? Is it a trip to Storm King? Is it a trip to the New York Botanical Garden? If it's raining, maybe it's staying home and watching Netflix. So the competition isn't between Storm King or the Garden or the Met and MoMA. It could be a basketball game and a beer. You know, the kinds of things that if everybody is seeking this. So I think the challenge, where I come out on this, is the challenge for institutions like mine, and maybe you could respond to this, David, is how to make sure that people know that the experience that they have will make them feel better than anything else they could do that day. So that's kind of like the vision, is the attraction of visitors, how to engage, attract, and then there's word of mouth that said, I could have done many, many things today, but I am so glad I went to Storm King. I'll never forget that visit. You must hear those things all the time from your visitors.
We do.
I bet.
And people come for a variety of reasons, whether it's public transportation or automobiles, of course, are still popular, but we have Coach USA and we have Metro North going to Garrison, where we have a van pick up people.
Oh, good.
We started a couple of years ago, so that's been very successful, and we're looking into more public transportation as well. But people do come for a full range of activity. We have family programs, and just being out in our environment, seeing the sculptures, the exhibitions, and riding bikes, walking around, it's really quite fabulous. And so it's a range of reasons people are coming.
You remind me that's the all-purpose visit. You think of a place where, so I'm going to use that not so typical family of 4, but you know, he wants to be outside and get some exercise, and she wants to go to a museum, and the kids want to, you know, do something else that is, and partly I think the places that you and I lead provide all of those experiences, which is really, really nice. And museums, I would say, the museums that I'm now more in touch with that are actually taking advantage of the landscape right outside their door, not just as their situation, whether you're in, you know, St. Louis or Denver or Dallas or Brooklyn, but actually allowing people to go out. I'm remembering, it just came to mind, it was not anything in my notes, but that I was lucky enough to go to Bilbao. This was many, many years ago. I think I was on a courier trip. And walking, my favorite experience about that was that one of the audio guides was Frank Gehry. You get in the lobby, you put the architect in your head, and he says, go outside, we're gonna walk around the building. And we actually had to, he made you touch the building, look at the river, see the grass. I hadn't thought about that yet as a natural experience, but I loved the idea that in order to experience, we were experiencing the sculpture of the building, but a lot of what he talked about was the way that great big sculpture that is, the Guggenheim Bilbao is actually situated in nature. I forgot about that until right now.
I would say he's more of an agrarian than a Bauhaus person, yes.
Mm-hmm. Why would you say that?
Well, soft shapes.
Soft shapes.
And more organic and rounded, his love of wood, his love of texture. So, we somehow abandoned our cave, our hut, our village architecture for the box. And that was possible with the, again, Industrial Revolution, central heating. So you could sleep in a box before you were, read Isaac Bashevis Singer. It was a great description in the beginning of the book, The Slave, where everybody huddled up for the night in front of the hearth in the kitchen, and the dinner was moved away, and you slept together, and with pigs and cattle too, chickens, everything. Same if you read, I loved Guns, Germs, and Steel, Jared Diamond.
Oh, right.
About how people, also recent, that's what we forget. So Frank Gehry probably had grandparents who conveyed the stories. It comes, it's what you're talking about and what you're doing too is storytelling.
Right.
And it comes back to storytelling. I had Sam Oka in my life who grew up in the Russian woods. So when my parents went out Sunday night and our housekeeper wasn't there and he babysat, he gave us everything to eat we weren't allowed to have. And
that
then
was your uncle?
My grandfather. Then he told us stories of the Russian woods that were scary and real. And, I begged him to stop sometimes. He was frightening me with the wolf and the farmer's coming back and the wolf is, oh, Grandpa, stop, But he could do all of the birds, all the sounds. People were connected to their trees when the nuts were coming down, the bushes when the berries. The lack of connection is what you're commenting on, and the need to reestablish it on all those levels that would engage the four members, so to speak.
Do you think, I can't help but think, I'm going to open it to questions in just a minute from all of you, but I think a lot about, I thought this at the Met, now I think of it at the Garden, it is, you must think of it too, that the storytelling is very important. And when, there must have been a time when we thought the authoritarian teacher was the way to convey information in a pleasant way, but I think the way that we're all thinking now is that the way in, and social media has impacted this, because the way in is I have to like it first. It goes back to I see it, I like it, now I want to know more about it. And I like the layers that technology can give us that say, I don't know, give a little bit of an anecdote. A colleague that I years ago worked on an exhibition with was such a fluid thinker, such a great teacher, and actually revealed to me that even as all of that was true and knew a lot about art, still when he walked through a great museum, his initial internal response to a painting that he hadn't seen was, that's so much bigger than I thought it was.
It's true.
Or, I didn't realize it was so red. The reproductions of it show it to be sort of purple. And initial response, now I'm interested. Now, wait, what is that? I wonder who painted it. But you have to allow yourself that easy in. And I think nature is the same way. The kinds of work that we're doing with nature is the same way. So even within the garden, one of the things I'm looking forward to doing is there is interpretation there, believe it or not. But I'm realizing that even though I have actual galleries, there's a rose garden and a peony connect collection and the maple trees are all together, the Japanese pines are all together, but there are no stories about them. There are lots and lots and lots of little record-keeping labels that give you the Latin names of all of them, but you're not in, if you're a horticulturalist or a scientist, that might be where you go. But I think most people would want to know, where am I? What is this forest? How long has it been here? And only then say, I wonder what that tree is. I wonder, like, which one is, which, are there any hemlocks remaining? And what was an old growth hemlock forest? Where are they and what do they look like? But so I'm looking forward to kind of the kinds of interpretations that actually will engage people. We used to say a long time ago, like on their level, like levels of, it isn't really about levels of understanding or education. It's about meeting people where they live and allowing those stories to come out. I love walking around now and hearing people look at, the daffodils. We have 1 million daffodils. It was a project, more than 1 million daffodils. And just watching people walk through the daffodils and tell their stories about the color yellow or daffodils that they'd seen when they were growing up. There were some kids doing snow angels in the daffodils. It was just, and they weren't supposed to do that. But I'd love to open it up to questions from the audience. If otherwise, we could continue talking all morning. But questions? Over here. I think Linda has a mic, or maybe you can just talk. See if we can hear you. No?
The video.
Oh, because of the video. I see.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the very insightful talk. I was very intrigued about the notion of natural landscape as source of healing and something that it's been promoted in places like Botanical Garden and Storm King. I have a question which is a kind of economical nature. I am myself an artist working with nature, art in nature, and working on a landscape and several human-made intervention, very ephemeral. And as you all know, maintenance in the landscape, it's something paramount and requires a lot of economical effort. So I was wondering if there is such a thing as a socio-economical infrastructure which help with the preservation of less known, less popular art in nature work. And I strongly believe that such infrastructure, which is not the Land Conservancy, unfortunately, at least in the county where my work is, such infrastructure would really help to promote many art in nature intervention. Like if there is support for a painter to produce work on canvas or sculpture, as we know, working in the land requires much stronger effort, which go beyond the individual capacity.
Is the question whether there are institutions that will encourage outdoor sculpture or artists working with natural materials? I think
with Landon, yeah.
I think we've landed there, absolutely, yeah. What comes to mind, maybe this isn't the answer to your question though, is one that I thought about even when I worked indoors in a museum, is the whole nature of conservation, art conservation now, which has long been to keep things the way that they were meant to be or restore them to their original way of being, which remains true for, I would say, historic works of art, but may never be true for works that are created outdoors that would be exposed to elements and sort of that whole notion that something looks like this today because it was created today. Now let's keep it that way. Becomes a losing battle, I think, or we're looking maybe to artists in nature to understand that their works will change because of conditions outside or the materials that are being used. But thank you for the question. I think Linda's got the mic. Uh-huh. And then up here. Yeah.
You know, I was thinking about Michelle's grandfather and the woods, the trees that he lived. Oh, I have to turn, excuse me. Is that better? Yes. You know, I had a Russian brother-in-law, and I wonder if it's part of being Russian to have this familiarity with the forest, because he used to look for mushrooms. And he said it's so easy to find them. In Russian, the mushrooms are named like under the oak tree. So you have you zero in on them by the tree. You don't. It eliminates a lot of the trial and error of the poisonous mushrooms, and that familiarity with nature was absolutely marvelous. Well, it's just an additional comment. I don't know if it's true what he said about the mushrooms, but I accepted it as true.
I think it
If anyone
was true.
speaks Russian.
Was it true?
I think it's true for the Swiss. I've been mushrooming way up in the mountains, and yeah, they know. In fact, I read recently somebody's gift. I think it was in a New York Times Sunday magazine. Somebody's mother-in-law's gift to them for a wedding was where she knew this patch was on some island. And she then eventually took them there, and that was what they had. And there were chanterelles. I think we've gotten a tiny bit lost, but I think we're the breadcrumbing back to not Hansel and Gretel's cottage, but maybe the New York Botanical Garden. But those are stories that storytelling could be a great activity for rainy days.
Storytelling. I'm interested in, I want more questions, but we opened just last year, almost a year ago, something called the Edible Academy, which I think is going to be a great place for storytelling, because when people get around food, they tell stories, or they should tell stories. And I feel like it's now part of the Edible Academy is mainly a children's facility, day campers and school kids who come and plant seeds and watch carrots grow and then eat them. It's very sort of Alice Waters in concept, or city schools. And we have many, many other programs outside of the garden, something called Bronx Green Up that now has about 300 community gardens around the Bronx doing this work. And also, the people who lead it now are seeing that it's one thing to know how to make a raised bed. It's another thing to plant a seed. Yet another thing to see that turn into basil or oregano. But it's yet another thing then to make a meal out of those foods and talk about the food that you're eating, or what it reminds you of, or how good it tastes. And I think that's sort of where we need to be, coming full circle.
Hi, I wonder whether any or all of you would say something about the relationship between...
No, you're okay. I'm just, yep.
About the relationship between art that kind of sits in nature and art that is made of nature. I think a lot of sculpture parks have art that sits in dialogue with the landscape but is of a substance that is kind of separate from nature. And then there are other works of art that are actually composed of nature and change and grow. And I just wonder whether you have any thoughts about whether those are a continuum or whether they're two separate kinds of things.
David, you want to think about that? Maybe it's a weather question, isn't it? It's, what can withstand?
I think it's an interesting question. There are a lot of artists that are working with natural materials, whether it's Maya Lin with the Storm King wave field that we have, or Andy Goldsworthy with the stones from our property. But very challenging to preserve and maintain sculptures that are made out of earth and other materials. and that are really living because it has grass on it and 4.5 acres, and people like to walk on the 7 waves, and we're trying to keep them more pointed and not have a trail on top of them, and and what what type of grass should be there, and how long should the grass be? How do we mow it? It's been very challenging and continues to be.
Thank you for, maybe,
Response to that also?
did you want to respond? We have a question in the front row next. Thank you. Did you want to say anything?
I think times have changed. I think the removal of the Richard Serra from the urban
Oh, yes.
site at the courthouse was such a turning point in how we look at materials, what's appropriate in an urban setting, what's appropriate. It was a game changer that I think it's still percolating. And I never thought it would happen, so I'm quite astounded, and I think that was the beginning of the pushback of the large welded metal fabricated pieces. I think those are what you're referring to, that did dominate for a long time, because it was frankly very easy to make big things when you're starting with extruded metals, big pieces of metal. And scale was a major factor in the art world of the 80s and 90s and, up till now. In fact, getting back to what you said earlier, when I came to MoMA, when I lived in Michigan and saw the Brancusis for the first time, I couldn't believe how small they were because I'd seen big slides in the art history room. So, but I think scale is no longer the defining issue. And then I think also Corten steel itself has had issues of maintenance. Certainly, so it's constantly moving, and back to what Kari said, what gets to be restored, what was great and then can be moved aside, and is all going to be looked at by eyes that are looking, that have a different view than we did, and frankly, they were the Holocene. It's a different time.
A different time. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, and it was a very beautiful and poetic journey, I would say, we heard. And I fully agree that mankind should be brought closer to nature. But matter of the fact is that mankind is massively destroying nature, and maybe there will not be too many bees to be seen. And I think as an artist, we have also an obligation to touch on those topics. And I think this was missing a little bit for me in the discourse so far. Thank you.
Thank you for the comment. No, it's so important for artists. You're an artist? Yeah, it's just so important for artists to be calling attention to nature. Absolutely.
I'm an artist and an environmental economist.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic.
Just to follow that very nice point, we are losing the war on this, and the idea of the force, and even in the title, the force of nature, it gives such a powerful position to the word nature that is in the title here. You're all committed to creating these places, these refuges from the onslaught, really, of technology and this diversion of time at the time that you talk about, that you watch the food grow. It takes time to do that. It takes time to harvest it, then to cook it. And our whole society is based on this, this rapidness of everything that goes on. So, you're in your institutions, you don't have the time to think about that. You're spending all of your time building these wonderful places that are a refuge from all of this activity that surrounds us. But I wonder if you have given some time to think about what we can do to crunch the notion of the environmental impact that our economics are leading us to. You're providing a place to go to remind us, but do you have any thoughts on what we can do to correct the course that we're on? I know you're not spending much time on it with all the things that you're doing, but has something occurred to you that we're not doing that we can do to better preserve the nature that we all really perceive to?
I would say, just to dispel the notion that, speak for myself, that I'm too busy to think about that. That's all I think about. It's all I think about. And I would also say in my position now, so my predecessor, the amazing Gregory Long, cleaned up that house. Oh my gosh, there are no more cars being washed in the Bronx River. There are no more dogs being walked on the property. The Haupt Conservatory is not going to fall down. The library building is state-of-the-art and climate controlled. The work over the past 30 years was to get that house in order. And what he's handed off to me is now a house that's in order, that has to be maintained, can't just let it go, but that now has to be a force in the world. That has to not only be a destination, oh, lovely day at the train show, took my mother to the orchid show. The compelling reasons to go there, if I'm doing my job right, and it's 9 months, are that people leave actually inspired to live better lives, to eat different foods. I have to also be very conscious of what we do best, and that's plants. So not politics, not climate change conferences, but things that will inspire people to not just say, oh, what a lovely day at the New York Botanical Garden, now we're going to go out and eat some fast food, but actually to compel people to change the way that they behave a little bit. I'm conscious of time, and I've been holding on my lap this Oliver Sacks's new book that just came out. I don't know if many of you saw, a Sunday ago, an excerpt from this book that is about, I won't read the quote, but the excerpt that he wrote about the meaning of botanical gardens in his life as places of solace, as places that made him they made him feel better. It wasn't just, oh, if I go there as a destination, I'll feel joy, but actually that carried on into his work as a neurologist. And I didn't realize, I was reading, now finally got the book, reading that, the famous movie Awakenings with Robert De Niro and Robin Williams was actually based on Sacks's work at Beth Abraham Hospital that is less than half a mile from the New York Botanical Garden, a place that was in the Bronx Parkway where he would take his Parkinson's patients and others with the kinds of things that you saw in that movie out into what were large grounds. That facility no longer has large grounds. Now there's because it grew, there's like a patio with some potted plants, but it's still used in that way. But when he brought his patients from Beth Abraham down the road to the Moshulu Parkway into the New York Botanical Garden, if they came over a period of time, he actually saw changes in their disease. He saw changes in their minds. I'm veering away from environmentalism and climate change a little bit, but if that would be another tack that I think about a lot, the ways that we can, through our science programs, through our attachment to agriculture, through our attachment to saving an old growth forest, not just a destination that's lovely, but actually a place that will teach you that biodiversity is at risk and we should all be preserving it, but also makes us feel better. So where I'm in the middle of a strategic plan that is all about people and the planet, the opportunities are endless. So at least for me, stay tuned. So I don't know if either of you want to make any closing remarks, or are we good?
No, I think we're good. I just want to say that Storm King is dedicated to working with artists, and that's a very important mission for what we do and having people visit. We had 172,000 people last year, even though it rained every week. It was terrific.
That's great.
And
We should all
there
visit.
are many reasons to visit, and people come out to because they want to be away from urban areas. They want to have some privacy if loved ones passed away or something. There are multitudes of reasons, and we had many people after 9/11 visit. It was a very strong attendance after that terrible situation. But and programs are really excellent for family programs and at all levels.
That's great. Thank you, David. Michelle, wrap us up.
Wrap you up. Wrap you up. Well, I'll wrap you up with a 1941 poem written when Florida had a poet laureate, and they also had a Poinciana festival. So this was based on this flowering flamboyant that came every year. As it turns out, the tree had a moment when it didn't. They'd now realized that they had put electrical lines which interfered with its ability to pollinate. So that's on South Miami Avenue. But these four lines are called superlative, and they apply, I dedicate it to both your acreage and what's on it and yours as well. It's a substantial amount of open and public. It's pretty wonderful. But it goes, the Poinciana's bloom is brief, well, so are ecstasy and grief. Superlatives, like flame and song, are not meant to last very long.
Oh,
Thank you. What can I say after that? That's the best closing. I would like to say one thing to this gentleman. I think the solar panels project is very much to the point
yes.
of art, ecology, environmentalism, consciousness, awareness, a pathway, right? Treading another pathway to thinking about how all these pieces work together. So I want to thank this outstanding panel. Thank you all for your work and for your conversation today, and thank you so much for being here. We have one more panel tomorrow on what is taste. You can think about the Met Gala, and then you can come to the panel tomorrow morning and discuss. Thank you all.
So funny.
Bye-bye.
So nice to
Thank you
hear
both
you
so
and
much.
Thank you, Karen.